resist the temptation to cut the supply route to the Third Army by surrounding the city of Suez. A tense 48 hours followed. The Soviets protested these violations of the ceasefire we had negotiated in Moscow a few days earlier, demanded its joint reconstitution by American and Soviet action, and threatened unilateral military action to reimpose it. Sadat could have used the Soviet pressure for his own purposes, but he never resorted to it. After a robust American rebuff, the Soviets substituted a proposal enabling them to participate with non-combat observers to supervise the ceasefire. The outcome was UN Resolution 340, which provided for a UN emergency force of international observers drawn from non-permanent members of the UN Security Council. Sadat used the opportunity for a symbolic gesture expressing his commitment to a new approach to the conflict. Since the 1948-9 armistice, no Egyptian and Israeli officials had negotiated face-to-face. To the surprise of all parties, Sadat now informed the Israelis that he was sending military officers to kilometer 80 on the Cairo-Suez road to discuss the details of Resolution 340 and to arrange a resupply for Egypt's trapped Third Army. For various technical reasons, the actual negotiation was moved from kilometer 80 to kilometer 101. This did not amount to a formal recognition of Israel, or a diplomatic one. Rather, it was a symbol of Sadat's determination to launch Egypt on a new course. Meir and Sadat. After the war, on November 1, 1973, Prime Minister Meir came to Washington. Of all the Israeli leaders with whom I dealt, none was more difficult, and there was none that moved me more. She was an original. Her wrinkled face testified to the turmoil of a lifetime pioneering a new society in a strange and forbidding environment. Israel, eked out on a tiny bit of land, precarious, ostracized, threatened by implacably hostile neighbors, had salvaged survival from its history by only a narrow margin. Mrs. Meir's wary eyes seemed ever on the lookout for unexpected challenges, especially from her impetuous American allies. She saw it as her mission to protect what had been invested with such fervent hope by a people who for 2,000 years had endured a precarious existence in the diaspora. My own childhood in Hitler's Germany gave me an understanding of her endemic apprehensiveness. I also recognized a certain justice in her present attitude toward us. As the victim of a military attack, her government now faced a situation in which demands for a peace process were multiplying from the American ally on which she depended, but which never quite seemed to grasp her traumas. She treated me, being Jewish, as a favorite nephew who, when he disagreed, deeply disappointed her. Our relationship was familiar enough that I came habitually to call her Golda and still think of her as such. My wife, Nancy, used to say that arguments between Golda and me at dinner in Golda's home in Israel constituted some of the most dramatic theatrical performances she had ever witnessed. Nancy did not mention how they usually ended. Golda and I would withdraw to the kitchen and work out a solution. Meir arrived in Washington at the first opportunity after the ceasefire. She was, above all, unhappy that we had insisted on a resupply, albeit of non-military supplies, for the Egyptian Third Army. She was railing, in effect, not against specific policies but against the change in strategic realities, the demonstration of Israeli vulnerability, and the apparent emergence of Egypt as an accepted American negotiating partner. Restraint was being urged on her to permit the country that had attacked hers to evolve in a more peaceful direction. This, to Meir, was not a self-evident proposition. Meir, we didn't start the war, yet. Kissinger, Madam Prime Minister, we are faced with a very tragic situation. You didn't start the war, but you face a need for wise decisions to protect the survival of Israel. This is what you face. This is my honest judgment as a friend. Mayer, you're saying we have no choice. Kissinger, we face the international situation that I described to you. For a nation to pretend to total autonomy is a form of nostalgia. Reality dictates that every nation, even the most powerful, adapt its conduct to the capabilities and purposes of its neighbors and rivals. That Mayer ultimately acted accordingly is a tribute to her leadership. On her visit to Washington, Prime Minister Mayer pursued two outcomes simultaneously: a consensus with her indispensable ally and a consensus of her people, a majority of whom were still in shock from the change in their circumstances and many of whom remained adamantly belligerent. UN supervision of the resupply meant that it could be accomplished without the direct cooperation of the combatants. At a dinner at the Israeli embassy, she engaged in some semi-public criticisms of the U.S. administration, perhaps made for the benefit of the Israeli assistants, ministers, and advisors in attendance. Setting aside these chastisements, I called on her the next day at Blair House, the residence of state guests, at a private meeting confined to advisors where she signaled openness to resupply under 6 conditions I outlined, including the start of talks on disengagement. The 6 points also provided for the exchange of prisoners of war at the very beginning of the process, a salient concern to Israel. With Israeli elections imminent, Mayer's cabinet at first refused to authorize her to accept these terms while she was in Washington. But by now we understood Israeli politics well enough to recognize that the Prime Minister would not have put forward such a program had she judged the draft unacceptable. Her cabinet would not overrule her when she was actually in the chair. Sadat's vision of a new negotiation could not have prevailed without Mayer's participation. By entering negotiations at all, she was accepting the possibility of relinquishing territory for the first time in Israeli history. By agreeing to non-military resupply of the Third Army, she forewent the possibility of Israel's achieving a decisive military victory. At the same time, she created the precondition for a breakthrough in negotiations. She overcame her instincts for the sake of a possible move toward peace. Neither Sadat nor Mayer could have achieved this first step without the other. The meeting at the Tara Palace. On November 7, 1973, just 4 days after Mayer's visit, I met Sadat for the first time. He had prepared the ground for American diplomacy by sidelining Soviet military action in the crisis over the erosion of the ceasefire. Egypt's strategic objective in launching the war, we later discovered, was to transform the situation psychologically in order to make a sustainable peace. Sadat's openness to negotiation then transformed our view of him. He was no longer a radical in our eyes. Heretofore Sadat's moves had been more symbolic than fundamental. Were we dealing with a genuinely new approach or a tactical variation on the established pattern? The Arab demand for Israel's immediate return to the pre-June 1967 frontiers remained on the table, as a precondition for negotiation. Recognition of the legitimacy of the State of Israel had not even been hinted at. The meeting might lead either to step-by-step progress or to an impasse if Sadat insisted on an overall settlement. Major issues needed to be resolved during our discussions. The most immediate was resupply of the Third Army, which was happening on an ad hoc basis. Second came the goal of negotiations on Middle East peace, called for in the ceasefire but never formally defined. Third was the future of Egyptian-American relations, technically still based on Nasser's breaking of diplomatic ties at the end of the 1967 war. The encounter took place in the Tara Palace, in a once fashionable suburb of Cairo now struggling to maintain appearances. I was hurried toward a veranda where a mob of journalists was assembled, accompanied by a significant number of Sadat staffers. There were no visible security precautions. Amidst this chaos, a deep baritone uttered the words, "Welcome, welcome." Without any formal ceremony, Sadat had arrived. He was wearing a khaki military uniform with an overcoat slung over his shoulders. November in Cairo can be quite cold. Dispensing with any opening statement and pausing only for a brief round of pictures by photographers, he escorted me into a large room with French doors that overlooked an expansive lawn. On it, wicker chairs had been placed for our aides. We sat on a sofa facing the gardens, both of us affecting nonchalance though well aware that the nature of Egyptian, American and probably Arab-American relations in the immediate future could depend on the outcome. Appearing extremely relaxed, Sadat filled his pipe, lit it and started the conversation by saying that he had been longing for a personal meeting. "I have a plan for you. I have named it the Kissinger Plan." At this, he walked across the room to an easel on which situation maps had been placed. Standing in front of them, he referred to my prior talks with Hafiz Ismail. As noted earlier, I had answered Ismail's proposal for Israeli withdrawal from all of Sinai by suggesting interim arrangements to permit adjustment to a peace process before making final decisions. Ismail had rejected our step-by-step proposal. Sadat now accepted it, naming it the Kissinger Plan. He suggested as an initial step an Israeli withdrawal across 2/3 of the Sinai to a line from El Arish, a city about 20 miles from the Israeli frontier and 90 miles from the Suez Canal, to the Ras Mohammed National Park at the southern edge of the Sinai Peninsula. It was a stunning opening for a negotiation that we had expected to be protracted and difficult, not because his suggestion was so unprecedented, it was in fact unrealistic, but because he was articulating a willingness to explore provisional phases of disengagement. In no other such instance had I encountered an opposite number who conceded the field in his opening move. Every Arab leader with whom we had raised the idea of an interim settlement had rejected it. Sadat had accepted it before it could even be proposed. But Sadat must have known that it would be impossible to convince Israel's leaders to withdraw such a distance, including the strategic passes in the center of the Sinai, at the end of a war started by Egypt. To avoid beginning the dialogue with Sadat in a deadlock, I invited him to explain the considerations that led him to where we found ourselves. Sadat at first deliberately, and then with growing intensity, described his purposes. He was disillusioned with the Soviets. They had been unable or unwilling to work with the United States to bring about a Middle East peace compatible with Egypt's dignity. The language in the communiqué ending the Moscow summit of 1972 had removed any doubt about Soviet priorities. They would not risk tensions with America over Egypt. The decision to expel some 20,000 Soviet advisors had been taken as a first step toward restoring Egyptian dignity, and the war was its further expression. He had given no advance warning for the expulsion and had asked America for no reward afterward. Sadat spoke in excellent English if in a somewhat stilted manner, precise and formal, perhaps because he had taught himself from newspapers, short stories and books while in British prisons during the war. His exposition was delivered emphatically, with his eyes slightly narrowed, as if viewing some distant horizon. He had concluded, he said, that no progress could be made without long-term American goodwill. He would therefore seek reconciliation with America and a lasting peace for the Middle East. His quest was for a change in basic attitudes, not of lines on a map. He had given me his Kissinger plan. What, he asked, was mine? The objective of the dialogue, I said, was a lasting peace. Its durability, however, would depend on the parties gaining each other's confidence in stages, thereby accruing confidence in the process itself. A first move could not possibly achieve either peace or confidence. At the present moment, I continued, Sadat's Kissinger plan was too ambitious. A more realistic withdrawal line for Israeli forces would fall well short of his proposal, somewhere to the west of the Mitla and Gidi passes. It would probably require several months to negotiate. We would do our best to achieve the disengagement process, with a view to continuing it, and base a peace process on it. A conversation with Sadat was frequently interrupted by pauses for reflection. Now, after one of those pauses, he responded with just 2 words, "And Israel?" I replied, similarly cryptically, by handing him the 6 points worked out with Prime Minister Meir. Sadat looked at the paper for a few minutes and accepted it without any discussion. Nasser had been unwise, he summed up, to seek to harass America into cooperation. The Third Army was not the heart of the matter between Egypt and America. Sadat's own aim, by contrast, was relations of confidence with America and peace with Israel. To express this symbolically, he would announce after our meeting what we had not even proposed: an end to Egypt's diplomatic boycott of the United States, in place since 1967. Through the establishment of an Egyptian interest section in Washington, headed by an ambassador. The ambassador would be named in December 1973. This was the same procedure we had followed earlier that same year in establishing relations with China. Full diplomatic relations would follow the conclusion of a disengagement agreement. These remarks were put forward not in conditional form, nor as a demand for reciprocity, but rather as a description of a desirable course. Against what we later learned was the near unanimous sentiment of his advisers, Sadat had decided to take his chances on the word of an American Secretary of State that the United States would facilitate significant progress in Egyptian-Israeli territorial negotiations over a period of 3 months. Throughout, the Third Army would remain trapped. If anything were to go wrong, Sadat would be ruined and Egypt humiliated. A seemingly minor step, non-military supplies for the Third Army after it had become beleaguered, created an opportunity for preliminary cooperation and became a symbol for progress towards peace. While I was still in Cairo, the 6 points worked out with Mrs. Meir in Washington and now accepted by Sadat were put into treaty language by Assistant Secretary of State Joe Sisko and Egyptian Foreign Minister Ismail Fahmy. By the end of the visit, Sadat had achieved the initial purpose of his daring gamble. He had broken the status quo in order to open the possibility of negotiation with Israel under American auspices. His ultimate purpose was to end the conflict with Israel that had sapped Egyptian energy and confidence since the June 1967 war. In his mind, the existence of Israel was not a threat to Egypt's being, war with Israel was. That threat could be reduced and ultimately eliminated through a new concept of security based on the process of peace with Egypt's adversary, rather than its annihilation. Even successful negotiations sometimes leave in the negotiators' memories uneasy traces of their compromises, which cast a shadow over future efforts. Sadat's view of this meeting is contained in his memoirs. Our first session of talks took 3 hours. The first hour made me feel I was dealing with an entirely new mentality, a new political method. Anyone seeing us after that first hour in Al Tahira Palace would have thought we had been friends for years. There was no difficulty in understanding one another, and so we agreed on a 6-point program for action, including a U.S. pledge of return to the October 22 ceasefire line within the framework of the force's disengagement. Sadat's willingness to accept disengagement, together with the 6 points, was a rare occasion where one side in a negotiation unilaterally abandons its prerogative for haggling. His insight was that establishing trust and goodwill would be more important, in the end, than securing immediate concessions. Such mutual confidence would prove essential because the parties had traversed only the first step in the long journey they would chart. From Geneva to disengagement. Following the Tara Palace meeting, the obvious next move would have been to continue the step-by-step approach immediately. But this was precluded by Sadat's obligation to his ally Assad not to settle separately. Also, the United States, in the ceasefire talks in Moscow, had agreed to pursue an overall negotiation in concert with the Soviet Union. In consequence, a Middle East peace conference was assembled in Geneva in December 1973. The conference was meant to provide a forum to legitimize follow-on negotiations. All the regional parties were invited to initial discussions at Geneva, as well as the United States and the Soviet Union as facilitators of the peace process. Egypt was under political pressure, verging on obligation, to participate. It had joined the Khartoum Declaration in 1967, which had rejected separate Arab negotiations with Israel, as had Sadat's own pronouncements before and during the 1973 war. Sadat, recognizing Egypt's and his allies' momentum toward the Geneva Conference, decided to unilaterally ensure its abandonment. Weary of inter-Arab disputes and distrustful of the Soviets, Sadat rejected an overall approach, fearing that the multiplication of vetoes would thwart agreement and that Cold War rivalries would overwhelm Arab priorities. And indeed, any prospects for agreement at Geneva quickly dissolved. Assad of Syria refused to attend. The participation of Jordan, which was governing the West Bank, became a matter of controversy. The Soviet Union was more concerned with the evolution of détente than with the regional negotiation, or else it tolerated a step-by-step approach because it was convinced that it would fail. Thus the Geneva Conference of the United States, the Soviet Union, Israel, Egypt and Jordan suspended itself to permit exploration of separate component issues, which in any case had been the design of both Sadat and the United States. Everything depended now on whether Egypt and Israel could transform exploratory discussions into something tangible. This required agreement on the extent of Israeli withdrawal, on the definition between the parties of zones of armaments limitations, on the ending of Arab boycotts and on ways to control and legitimize any agreements. Israel's willingness to undertake its first withdrawal from occupied territory would determine the outcome. For that reason, Moshe Dayan became a key player. As close to a professional military person as the Israeli system of citizen-soldier permits, distinguished by the range and suppleness of his intellect, Dayan was seemingly made to guide the emerging peace process for Israel. But the opportunity found him melancholy. He had been surprised by the outbreak of the war, tricked by Sadat's feints, and he knew that he would pay a political price for having misjudged the mobilization. Both he and Meir would be out of office by June 1974. Yet Dayan performed his task with dignity. He understood the profound significance of Israel's first territorial withdrawal from the 1967 borders. And he knew that, although his personal participation was coming to an end, he stood at the beginning of a process that was expected to develop its own momentum. On January 4, 1974, in Washington to begin the negotiations, Dayan proposed a withdrawal line of some 12 to 20 miles from the Suez Canal, far less than Sadat had put forward in his Kissinger plan. But, according to Dayan, it was the maximum feasible concession. Any farther east and Israel would lose control of the only north-south road in the Sinai west of the passes. Dayan had no interest in assuming a tougher line for bargaining purposes, and he wanted to avoid political maneuvering. In 7 hours of discussion extending over 2 days, he laid out his proposal on an elaborate map of new dividing lines, including zones of limited armaments. The following week, I delivered Dayan's meticulous map to Sadat. Our meetings on the details of disengagement had been set for Aswan, a desert city 425 miles south of Cairo, where Sadat was spending the winter. At our first meeting on January 11th, he put forward 2 startling propositions. He would accept the Israeli withdrawal lines if I would remain in the region to accelerate the outcome in a shuttle between Egypt and Israel. Sadat then gave himself, and the American team, a deadline. For the next weekend, January 18th, he had scheduled a visit to his Arab brethren to discuss the oil embargo that OPEC had imposed on the United States during the October War. If a disengagement agreement were concluded by then, and Sadat hoped it would be, he would urge an end to the embargo. Although he felt that some of the Israeli proposals involved compromises to sovereignty that could not be countenanced, those issues could be raised at a later stage of the negotiations. The shuttle sped up negotiations in an unprecedented manner. 7 shuttles took place between January 11th and January 18th. During one of them, January 12th to 13th, Dayan came up with a complicated outline of the substance of demilitarization within the disengagement zones. On January 14th, Sadat, for the only time in my acquaintance with him, changed the arrangement from a face-to-face meeting to a conference, with the American team, Ambassador Hermann Eilts and Joe Sisko, facing him and Foreign Minister Fahmy and Defense Minister Ghazi across the table, perhaps in an effort to share the responsibility for painful decisions. That occasion turned into a dramatic confrontation between Sadat and his associates. The withdrawal line was reaffirmed without controversy, but Dayan's proposal for zones of limited armaments in territory vacated by Israeli forces evoked passionate opposition. Sadat had expressed to me previously his firm conviction that a foreign country, especially a foreign country at war with Egypt, must not be allowed to prescribe the deployment of Egyptian forces to defend Egypt on Egyptian soil. Fahmy and Ghazi now objected on similar grounds, and in particular to the proposed limit of 30 Egyptian tanks across the Suez Canal. Ghazi vehemently closed his argument with, "No self-respecting Egyptian officer will sign an agreement containing such a provision." Sadat sat silently for a few moments. He emerged from this pensive state with an odd question to me: "Can we form a working committee from both sides here?" He meant everyone around the table except him and me. When I agreed, he suggested that the group develop limitations for armaments, reserving the issue of tanks to himself and me. He then invited me to follow him into an adjoining room. Once alone, he asked, referring to the limit on tanks across the Suez Canal, "Does she, Prime Minister Mayer, mean it?" I replied, "She is bargaining. But you have to decide how much time you want to spend on this issue." Sadat replied, "Let us join the others," without telling me his decision. At the conference table, he settled the controversy. "I have accepted 30 as the limit for Egyptian tanks across the canal. Dr. Kissinger will get me more, and you, Ghazi, will sign it." Sadat had avoided the looming deadlock. The working group agreed on limits for major categories of weapons. These were then passed to the Kilometer 101 Technical Group, established at the end of the war for implementing negotiated language. Meyer then raised the number of Egyptian tanks permitted on the east bank of the canal to over 100. The shuttle procedure not only speeded decisions, it enabled Sadat to deepen and advance the dialogue. Meyer, he said, would understand that the size of the tank force across the canal was largely of symbolic significance. If I want to attack, I will put 1,000 tanks across the canal in one night. So as a sign of my commitment to peace, you can convey to Meyer my assurance that I will put no tanks across the canal. But I want the Prime Minister to understand that the entire future of the agreement depends on psychological factors. Israel must not offend the dignity of the Egyptian armed forces by overbearing demands. You can tell her from me that I have committed myself to this course. During the next shuttle, January 16, Sadat asked for a map of the proposed arms limitation zones between Egyptian and Israeli forces in the Sinai. He summarily struck out its many subdivisions. In their place, he drew one simple dividing line, splitting the zones into two parts, one Israeli, the other Egyptian. Limitations, he said, should be spelled out as distances from those lines to the canal, not in terms of national forces. He also came up with an ingenious idea for avoiding debates about who had yielded to whom. Israel and Egypt, rather than describing the agreement as a series of obligations each to the other, should express them as mutual commitments to the President of the United States. In this manner, the agreement would be indirectly guaranteed by Washington. To stress the American role in the supervision, he proposed 2 UN technical inspection units using American technology and American personnel along the Suez Canal. It took only 2 more shuttles to put the first disengagement agreement into final form. After months of war and tactical maneuvers, Sadat had needed a mere week of dialogue to construct a moment when both parties dared to pronounce the word peace. After approving the working group's final document for transmission to Israel, he added a message to Meyer about his dedication to a genuine peace. It paralleled what he had said during the discussion on tank limits a few days earlier. You must take my word seriously. When I made my initiative in 1971, I meant it. When I threatened war, I meant it. When I talk of peace now, I mean it. We never had contact before. We now have the services of Dr. Kissinger. Let us use him and talk to each other through him. It was still a step short of direct dialogue. The Israeli Prime Minister received me while bedridden with the flu. It is a good thing, she said laconically. Why is he doing it? A day later, she decided on a formal answer. I brought the final text of the agreement to Sadat, together with Meyer's reply, his first official, direct contact with an Israeli head of government. Her private letter read in part: I am deeply conscious of the significance of a message received by the Prime Minister of Israel from the President of Egypt. It is indeed a source of great satisfaction to me, and I sincerely hope that these contacts between us through Dr. Kissinger will continue, and prove to be an important turning point in our relations. I, for my part, will do my best to establish trust and understanding between us. Both our peoples need and deserve peace. It is my strongest conviction that peace is the goal toward which we must direct all our energies. Let me reiterate what you said in your message: when I talk of permanent peace between us, I mean it. Sadat had just finished reading the letter and folding it when an assistant entered the room and whispered something in his ear. Sadat walked over to me and kissed me on both cheeks. They have just signed the disengagement agreement at kilometer 101. I am today taking off my military uniform. I never expect to wear it again except for ceremonial occasions. Sadat added that he would depart that same day for Arab capitals, where he would describe what had been negotiated. I told him that I would be leaving that evening for Damascus to continue the step-by-step process with Assad, Sadat's ally in the war and partner in the 1967 Arab agreement never to negotiate on peace with Israel. It was important for Sadat's position in the Arab world that some progress be made on behalf of Syria. Sadat, while approving the diplomacy, had another idea. It would be good for you to spend a day in Luxor to experience the greatness of history, and, he added with one of his pauses, its fragility. The Syrian dimension. Of the individuals profiled in this volume, Sadat was the one whose philosophical and moral vision constituted the greatest breakthrough for his time and context. Syrian President Hafez al-Assad, in contrast, adopted a purely practical approach. Ruthless and highly intelligent, he aspired to leadership in the Arab world while conscious of his inability to achieve it. Syria, unlike Egypt, had a relatively short history of self-government. Centuries of conquest and division, of achievements alternating with catastrophes, had reduced Syria's magnitude and self-confidence necessary to act autonomously. Without Sadat's faith in his country's internal capacities, Assad sustained Syria through confrontations with its international environment by tenaciousness, willpower, and cunning. Damascus is at one and the same time the fount of modern Arab nationalism and a case study of its frustration at the hands of foreigners. Assad said to me on one occasion that before the First World War, Syria had been betrayed by Turkey, after it by Britain and France, and after the Second World War by America in backing the State of Israel. He thus had no incentive to form a cooperative relationship with the United States and made no effort to relate Syria to Western proposals for peace. He was outraged by Sadat's separate efforts, to the point of refusing to receive the Egyptian president in Damascus after the disengagement agreement, instead accepting Sadat's report of the first shuttle at the airport. But Assad was willing to promote Syria's specific interests. In particular, he wanted to regain the territory along the road to Damascus that had been acquired by Israel in its final offensive of the October War, and to apply the military disengagement of the Sinai Agreement to the Golan Heights, which had been occupied by Israel since 1967. Our dialogue thus consisted of highly granular discussions of military arrangements. No elevated language spurred the process. It was a practical progression that from time to time had to be salvaged from breakdowns that Assad himself would generate. I once described Assad's negotiating tactic as moving toward the edge of a precipice and occasionally jumping off it, counting on the presence of a tree to arrest his fall and enable him to climb back up. Using as a model the Sinai principles on the separation of forces, but without the accelerant of Sadat's moral vision, Assad put the Syrian shuttle through 35 days of mile-by-mile negotiations. Every Damascus meeting involved 3 stages, each chaired by Assad: an initial, extensive discussion with Assad alone, using only my interpreter, a session with Assad's military advisors, and a meeting with civilian ministers. He excluded even his interpreter from the first meeting so that he could limit what his subordinates learned of my report from Jerusalem. It was a convoluted style of decision-making, but it allowed Assad to disperse information as he saw fit. It also made for protracted meetings for whose length Israeli leaders could find no explanation and which kept them on edge. On the night of the 34th day, Assad drove matters to a point at which a breakup seemed inevitable. We had already drafted the communiqué announcing the end of the negotiations, Literally as I was heading for the door of our presumed final meeting, when Assad found a way to resume the negotiations. He then expended 5 hours negotiating over negotiations and finally kept us haggling into the evening. In the end, the Syrians squeezed the last drop of blood out of the stone. The demarcation line was adjusted by a few hundred yards in an overall neutral direction. Ultimately, Israel would withdraw from territories 10 miles south of Damascus and from the town of Quneitra. The opposing forces and their weapons would be separated by 30 miles, so that heavy weapons could not reach the front line of the adversary. Assurances of enforcement, as in the Egyptian agreement, were made in a letter by the parties to the U.S. president. Needless to say, the Syrian shuttle did not end with the same elevated feeling as its Egyptian counterpart. The agreement between Syria and Israel was a brutal bargain between adversaries that adjusted only their relative position. Assad chose to follow Sadat's practical solutions while rejecting his moral framework. But, although there was no mention of the nature of peace, Assad was willing to make specific agreements that made the initiation of war much more difficult. Those realistic provisions, unleavened by emotion, were both practical and observable. In the event, the provisions of the so-called Golan Agreement endured, in part because, though Assad could have broken them, he never did. For all his pride and shrewdness, he finally accepted, in practice, an indirect and silent form of recognition of Israel. It had to have been a searing process for a radical to come to grips with such a possibility. His convictions of enmity with Israel were stronger than Sadat's, and so his journey was harder, his progress shorter. But, like Mayer from the other end of the telescope, he had caught a glimpse of the virtue of an end to conflict. Assad could not have achieved either his external purposes or his internal change if it had not been for Sadat's initiative. But he did substantially contribute, albeit through the pursuit of more mundane objectives, to the step-by-step resolution of regional disputes. And, paradoxically, Assad's ability to wring a negotiation dry of its idealism made it politically possible for Sadat to continue on the path to realizing his vision. Another step toward peace, the Sinai II Agreement. After the Syrian disengagement agreement, Sadat expected a return to the peace process with Israel. The logical next step would have been an agreement on the west bank of the Jordan River, occupied by Israel in the June 1967 war. But that path was precluded by internal Arab politics. Although the West Bank had been under the de facto governance of Jordan, it was neither part of Jordan nor itself sovereign. And, on October 28, 1974, soon after the Syrian agreement, the Arab League designated the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. This ensured that any attempt by Israel to disengage from the West Bank by negotiating with King Hussein of Jordan would have led to immediate civil conflict in the Arab world. And Israel was not prepared to deal with the PLO, sworn to its destruction. The West Bank was thereby removed from the step-by-step diplomacy. Another Egypt-Israel negotiation, on a further Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai, appeared as the sole feasible course for progress. That, however, had to wait until the impact of the resignation of Nixon, in August 1974, could be absorbed. Time had to be left for President Gerald Ford to be briefed internally and to assemble his own White House staff. In his first public statement, he appointed me as his Secretary of State, thus assuring continuity. Actually, the most significant assurance of continuity lay in the new president's personality. Raised and educated in Michigan, Ford embodied the most sterling qualities of Middle America: patriotism, confidence in fellowship, trust in American purposes, extraordinary common sense. In agreement with the peace principles for the Middle East that had evolved during his predecessor's tenure, he was above all committed to overcoming America's own internal divisions. Israel, too, had experienced a change of leaders. Prime Minister Meir had survived the previous December's elections, but public criticism over alleged failures in the prelude to the 1973 war convinced her to step aside. Her successor was Yitzhak Rabin, the first Sabra, native-born Israeli, to become the nation's prime minister. Rabin had been commander of the Israeli army in the 1967 war, and its victories had made him a national hero. Like Sadat, he was a soldier who had turned his aspirations to transcending war. In a poignant speech as prime minister, he said, "As a former military man, I will forever remember the silence of the moment before, the hush when the hands of the clock seem to be spinning forward, when time is running out and in another hour, another minute, the inferno will erupt. In that moment of great tension just before the finger pulls the trigger, just before the fuse begins to burn, in the terrible quiet of the moment, there is still time to wonder alone. Is it really imperative to act? Is there no other choice? No other way?" Rabin was as different from Meir as could be imagined. She had come to Israel as a pioneer. To her, every square inch of Israeli territory had been won by blood and was therefore sacred. In this thinking, to trade land for peace was to trade the absolute for the quite possibly ephemeral. To Rabin, born in the country, the wonder of Israel's existence loomed less saliently than the necessities of its survival. Rabin's view, informed by millennia of Jewish history, was that Israel's historical precariousness could only be overcome by linking his people to their Arab neighbors. Highly intelligent and well-educated, Rabin viewed the negotiating process through an analytical lens. To him, the step-by-step approach was a preference he expressed as a piece of land for a piece of peace. Rabin's cerebral version of the step-by-step approach was still not fully expressed in early 1975, when he and Sadat began exploring tentative negotiations along the Sinai model via American mediation. The early stages were smooth. The two men were committed to the idea of peace and agreed on a gradual, multi-stage approach. For the next step, both gravitated toward another Israeli withdrawal, Sadat in order to continue Egypt's separate journey toward peace, Rabin to acquaint his fractious cabinet with the facts of international life. In March 1975, Rabin sent a letter through me to Sadat. He expressed in his own way convictions similar to those Meir had written in January 1974. "It has always been my firm conviction that Egypt, by virtue of its cultural heritage, its strength, its size, and its influence, carries a leading voice with respect to the peacemaking effort in our region. From what Dr. Kissinger has conveyed to me, as well as from your public statements, I feel assured that you are determined to make strenuous efforts to achieve a settlement. I, on my part, am determined to make all efforts to promote peace between us, and it is in this spirit that I express the aspiration that we shall yet succeed in reaching an agreement that will do honor to our two peoples." When I delivered the letter, Sadat asked me who had thought it up. I admitted that I had encouraged it. He next inquired, "Did they write it?" "This is even more important." I answered truthfully that the letter had been drafted by Rabin. The next day, Sadat asked to see me alone and made the following oral reply. "My attitude is that power will never again play a role in the relations of our two peoples. I will try to handle the Arab people if Rabin handles the Israeli people. My determination is to bring about the ultimate withdrawal to agreed lines by peaceful means only. if a Geneva conference is assembled after this agreement is signed, I will not touch this agreement or change anything between us at Geneva. Assure Rabin from my side I am not dreaming of solving this at Geneva. Whatever the problems, I will not use force. I would be ready to meet Rabin whenever the Israeli occupation of Egyptian territory is ended. The concept now on the table was another Israeli withdrawal, this time beyond the passes in the central Sinai. In return, Rabin expected an Egyptian declaration of non-belligerency. A problem then emerged with the formula, a piece of land for a piece of peace, namely, that peace was not as divisible as land. Sadat was not prepared to declare a general end of belligerency, but he was willing to agree to refrain from a list of defined belligerent acts. The steps toward peace to be put forward by Egypt for the Israeli withdrawal beyond the passes proved controversial in Israel, and needed to be more than emotive phraseology. Insofar as words could accomplish it, no further reassurance against Israel's nightmares could be imagined than Sadat's communication with Rabin via American mediation. But Jewish history had taught that assurances alone did not ensure against tragedy. The fragility of human designs required legal or constitutional provisions to ensure their efficacy. An agreement needed to be approved by the Israeli cabinet and parliament, where Rabin, like all of his predecessors, possessed only a tiny majority, 65 out of 120. Divisions within the cabinet, voiced especially by Defense Minister Shimon Peres, later Israel's preeminent dove, but at that time a hardliner, could similarly jeopardize any peace plan. By March 1975, a draft treaty existed. But it still had vague elements that needed to be made explicit, especially on the state of belligerency. On March 18, in response to Rabin's objections, Sadat and Fahmy committed Egypt to a pledge not to use force even if the peace process were to falter. Sadat also promised, both to Israel and in a letter to the American president, not to attack Israel provided Israel made the same pledge in the same form to Egypt. And Sadat explicitly accepted that the passes in the Sinai from which Israel would withdraw were to be controlled by UN forces, rather than handed over to Egypt. Nevertheless, the Israeli cabinet was not yet ready to embrace what before the 1973 war would have been considered fulfillment of their desires. Yigal alone, the foreign minister, had opposed negotiations with Egypt altogether, preferring talks with Jordan over the West Bank. Defense Minister Peres, a lifelong rival of Rabin, continued to advocate a hard line, categorically rejecting the idea of relinquishing control of the Sinai passes for anything short of an explicit commitment to non-belligerency. Since Sadat felt that he could not formally pledge to end belligerency without rupturing Egypt's ties to the Arab world, the Israeli negotiators sought as a substitute a multiplying list of contingencies. By this route, Sadat could grant the substance of peace item by item while not using the phrase. In the event, these pieces of peace proved insufficient for the expected peace of land. Foundering on these nuances, the negotiations broke up at the end of March 1975. The shuttle was put on pause. It was, as Rabin put it to me, a Greek tragedy. President Ford had never been engaged in Mideast diplomacy but was very familiar with the military elements, from his service on the House Armed Services Committee. He met with both Rabin and Sadat. The meeting with Sadat seemed beset by the jinx of presidential meetings with Arab leaders in that domestic issues suddenly overwhelmed the issues of Middle East order. The first time Sadat met Nixon, Watergate was at its height, and Nixon resigned 6 weeks later. The weekend of his introduction to Sadat, Ford felt obliged to dismiss his Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger, and CIA Director, William Colby, to clear the decks for the 1976 presidential campaign. A substantial amount of time had to be devoted to presidential assurances to Sadat regarding the constancy of Ford's administration. Ford took the suspension of the shuttle hard. While making no secret of his restlessness, which I shared, he had decided to give Rabin time to conclude the internal Israeli debate. This was facilitated by Peres,